Please be seated. Back on the record. Is Dr. DeMaio outside? Are we ready to have the jury come back in?
We are, Your Honor.
Right, let's go ahead and have the jury come in. Yes. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and while you're getting settled in, I'll go ahead with my questions. If your answer is yes to any of them, please raise your hand. During the lunch recess, did any of you have any discussions amongst yourselves or with anybody else about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you use any type of an electronic device to get on the internet to do any independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology? Thank you. No hands are being raised. And finally, did any of you read or create any emails, text messages, tweets, social networking pages, or blogs about the case? No hands are being raised. Thank you very much. Mr. De La Rionda, you may inquire.
Please support. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
You've got a loud voice like I do, so hopefully we'll be able to hear each other.
Okay.
We also share another thing in common. Now, Doctor, you're not testifying here as to who started what led up to the death of Trayvon Martin.
That's correct, sir.
And you're not saying as to who attacked who, whether it was George Zimmerman who attacked Trayvon Martin or whether it was Trayvon Martin who attacked George Zimmerman. You can't say it to that, correct?
That's correct, sir.
In fact, you can't testify as to who threw the first punch.
That's correct, sir.
In fact, you can't really testify whether there was a first punch thrown.
That's correct, sir.
And you can't say whether it was Trayvon Martin defending himself or George Zimmerman defending himself in terms of when this first started.
When it first started, that's correct, sir.
Your really testimony is only focusing on at the time of the actual shot, correct? Would that be accurate?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And you're not stating here, are you, that everything George Zimmerman stated at the statement you saw, the reenactment, is the complete gospel truth?
That's correct, sir. I'm just stating the nature of the gunshot wound being consistent with his account of how he shot.
Right. But were you aware, sir, that the defendant had given 1, 2, 3, I believe at least 4, maybe 5 statements prior to that one?
I believe you had mentioned that to me, sir.
I think I mentioned that in your deposition, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, is there a reason why you only focused on the reenactment as opposed to the original statement that he gave?
Well, because I know what the reenactment said, and essentially he's holding to that account. And so what I'm saying is that what I did was I evaluated the objective evidence in regards to this account that's being presented here.
All right. Okay. I apologize. I interrupted you. Were you finished?
No, that's fine.
Thank you. Let me know if I ever interrupt you. I apologize. And I also told the court reporter that I would be slow, and so if you can do the same thing, she needs to get everything down. When we're talking to each other, make sure we don't talk over each other.
Yes, sir.
Am I correct in stating that you've always believed that the first statement is the most accurate statement?
The first statement is usually more accurate than when given weeks or months later.
Oh, okay.
Because you get that in depositions, you know.
I got you. Now, you mentioned your prior experience with the medical examiners. You were head of the medical examiners office in that beautiful city, San Antonio.
That's correct, sir.
That, in fact, when you go to the Alamo and right near there, you can go down and go actually to the water. You go down, what, about, I don't know how far you go down, but you go down somewhat.
Yeah, it's about 2 levels down. You're on the Riverwalk, right.
Okay, all right. Now, you mentioned that when you worked there for, what, 15, 20 years, I think?
25 years and 10 months.
Okay, didn't mean to cut it short. You mentioned you, as a medical examiner, it was important for you, was it not, to, before you render an opinion, to make sure you understood all the facts, correct?
Depends upon the case. You know, some cases you want more information. Some cases it's not necessary. It just depends on, everything's personal.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying is when police would bring you a case, the medical examiner, and obviously they bring you the body,
right,
and you start doing the autopsy, you'd want to know what all the witnesses said. You wouldn't just pick one witness and say, okay, what did you say? You would want to know what everybody else said to make sure it was consistent with the evidence that you saw, correct?
In most cases, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, you just focused on the defendant's statement, and I believe you said Mr. Good's statement, correct?
I focused on the defendant's statement because that's, as you pointed out earlier in your cross-examination, that's all that I'm concentrating on. Whether it's so, I went to see is if his statement was consistent, right, with what I found, or what was found as the gunshot wounds. The rest, I can't say.
Right, because you weren't provided with all the other statements of all the other witnesses, correct?
But again, I couldn't say I would have to disregard them in regards to the gunshot wound.
Okay.
Because the only one present there is Mr. Zimmerman. So you have to go by what he's saying.
Well, I respectfully beg to differ with you. There was another person there, wasn't there?
Well, there were a couple other witnesses, yes, sir.
No, I mean, respectfully, the other person there is not among us anymore.
Right. That's because he's the only one who communicates. That's
right,
correct.
He can't speak because he's dead.
Yeah.
Okay. Were you aware, by the way, that the deceased, the victim in this case, Trayvon Martin, was on the phone with a lady?
Yes, sir.
You didn't review her statement, did you?
No, sir.
But when you worked with the medical examiner's office as the chief medical examiner, you, in most cases, attempted to find out all the information before you came to an opinion.
It depends on what the case is about. Often the information from the witnesses, it goes more towards the manner of death rather than the cause of death. And in this case, there's no question what the manner of death is.
Okay. And so are you suggesting that then all the witnesses' testimony should just be disregarded?
For my purpose, not for the jury, but for my purposes, it's not important in my giving my opinion.
In terms of your limited opinion as to the gunshot wound itself, in terms of how it possibly could have occurred.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. The other statements are for the jury to evaluate, not for me.
Okay. So you're not saying that we should just disregard what led up to this, whether somebody was following or whether somebody was attacking somebody. You're not saying that should be disregarded.
That's not right. That's not what I'm doing. The rest of that is the jury. That's why they're sitting there.
Okay.
Right.
I didn't mean to imply that you were saying that. I just want to make sure the record was clear about that.
No, that's no problem.
Okay. And Mr. West asked you a few what we refer to as hypotheticals. What if, assuming this fact, and in order to give an opinion when somebody gives you a hypothetical, it has to be based on facts that are accurate and truthful, correct?
No, a hypothetical doesn't have to be true.
Oh, okay.
A hypothetical is just, suppose this and this happened.
Okay, so we would be speculating, I guess, or potentially speculating.
Well, it's not even speculating. You're just giving a presentation and you're asking what it is. So it doesn't even get to the speculating.
Okay. And you would agree that at least the one statement that you relied on, which I think was either the fourth or fifth statement that Mr. Zimmerman had given, the reenactment, that Mr. Zimmerman has a self-interest, correct, when he's talking to the police?
Yes, sir.
And one could even argue that he has a bias in not telling the truth.
One could argue that. I think that's your argument.
Yes, sir. And you would also agree that if his statement doesn't match the evidence, then it's not the truth, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And I guess in what you reviewed, you were aware, were you not, that the only person that was armed out there was George Zimmerman and not Trayvon Martin?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Were you aware that he wasn't just armed with a firearm, but that he was also armed with a flashlight?
Yes, sir. Actually, there's a photograph of the flashlight in the scene photos.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor? He has a big flashlight. This right here?
Yes, sir.
Did this do some damage to somebody?
It's,
I'm
yeah.
sorry, I apologize. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Well, it's not a good. I thought it was one of these all steel heavy things. I wouldn't consider it a really dangerous weapon.
You think it's all right to hit somebody like that real hard and it wouldn't cause any bruises?
I think it might cause a bruise, but it's just not heavy enough to be of significance.
So you were not provided with a statement of James Serdica, who described George Zimmerman on top of Trayvon Martin before the shooting?
I was not provided with that statement. That's correct, sir.
You were not provided with a statement of Celine Bahadur, were you?
No, sir.
And you mentioned you were provided with a statement of John Good. I think you stated originally an audio recorded statement and a written statement he gave, correct?
Yes, sir.
Were you aware that he gave also an additional sworn statement in which he described not hearing this at all?
No, sir. I don't think so.
Were you aware that he also stated under oath that he did not hear anything concrete at all?
No, sir.
I'm trying to do this chronologically, but I want to go back. I want to go back a little bit about your CV and your qualifications that Mr. West talked about in terms of where you've been and that kind of stuff. You mentioned that, I was curious, you mentioned something about shooting animals. Now, are we saying that this experiment was done while the animals were alive?
Following federal regulations, yes. What you have to do is the animals have to be kept in a federally approved area, and then a veterinarian has to be present at the time of the experiments, and the animals have to be anesthetized.
Okay, and so then you started shooting at them, or how many times were they shot?
I have to read the paper originally, but it was a test to determine whether the testing method used by firearms examiners was valid.
And you determined that it was, correct?
Yes, sir, it was.
Okay. You also mentioned that you've testified all over the world, really, I guess, or part of the world.
A couple of places, yes.
Okay. And you testified in criminal matters, both for the government or the state and also for the defense, correct?
Yes, sir.
And, in fact, you were asked about several cases that you had testified on behalf of. I think you testified in and you were nice enough to send me and Mr. West your list of your cases, at least within the last 5 years since you've been in private practice. Or is it 7 years?
It's 6 going on 7 now.
Okay. And I think you said, over 50 times or so? Or Do you recall the number?
No, I don't think I said a number how many times I've testified. But again, as I pointed out, most of them are civil cases.
Right, and I think one of them you mentioned was the Drew Peterson case, right?
That was a criminal case, yeah.
Yeah. And then also the Specter case, too, I think, right?
Yes, sir.
And in both of those cases, you testified for the defense, right?
Yes, sir.
By the way, how much are you getting paid to come testify here today?
Same thing I charge everybody, $400 an hour.
And how much total have you charged so far? I know you got to take a trip back, but...
Okay. Up till yesterday, $2,400. This is not exactly a complicated case forensically.
Okay. You mentioned that I think you brought your notes with you, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I guess most experts have their notes just to, if something is asked. What do you use it for, just to refresh your memory?
Because if you get a whole bunch of papers and you only are interested in one fact, it's easier just to put the fact down, that's all.
So they're like little cheat notes? I'm not saying anything improper.
No, I know what you mean.
Right, just like little bullets type things so you would be able to answer something? Or
Right, bullets.
And I think you prepared, a 5 or 6 page of notes that you provided to me this morning and to Mr. West?
Yeah, 5 pages. Well, it's 5 pages, but it's double-sided in some, so it's probably closer to 10. No, 8 maybe, something like that.
Okay. And I think you also mentioned as part of your review of this case, obviously you couldn't be there when the autopsy was done, so you actually reviewed the autopsy report, correct?
Oh, yes.
And your opinion is in part derived from reviewing Dr. Bowles' medical examiner report, correct?
That's correct, sir.
In terms of, obviously, the photographs that were taken, but in terms of his findings, shot to the heart, correct?
Right, sir.
There is no dispute about that the deceased, the victim in this case, Trayvon Martin, was shot in the heart.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. Now, did I understand you correctly that if you came over here and you pulled my heart out, that I could sit there and walk and talk for how long?
10 to 15 seconds, yes.
Okay, so if you pulled my heart out now, I could keep talking and just keep talking and talking and talking and just talking and talking and talking without a heart.
That's right.
Okay, for about 15 seconds or so?
Right. It's between 10 and 15 seconds. It's dependent on the oxygen supply to the head. And that's why some of the SWAT people will prefer shooting somebody in the head if it's a situation where the person has like a gun on somebody else. Okay.
Now, even though my heart is gone, I would still feel some pain, or would I not?
Oh, yeah, you still feel pain, but right.
Now, I think you stated that in this case you believe it was 12 to 15, or what did you say, 10 to 15 seconds, or 5 to...
No. What I said is I can't say.
Okay.
All I can say is that the minimum amount of time would be between 10 and 15 seconds.
Okay. And you said the maximum would be up to 3 minutes, did I get that right?
Well, I said that in all medical probability, the individual would have no cardiac function after I said 1 to 3 minutes, so 3 minutes is the outside.
And by the way, you're not here to testify as to, while this was going on, who was yelling for help, whether it was the victim or George Zimmerman. You can't say it, right?
No, sir. I'm not testifying to that. That's correct.
And, in fact, you can't testify as to one of the statements that George Zimmerman said where he said he pulled the gun from his holster and shot. You can't say that happened that way, correct?
Oh, you mean that he pulled the gun out of the holster?
Yes, sir.
Right. I can just say that the injuries are consistent with how he shot him, but not where he got the gun from.
Right. In terms of the shot being to the chest.
Right.
Okay. But in terms of how he claims that he grabbed the gun while the other person is kneeling over him or straddling him, how he managed to somehow get the gun out and shoot the other person, you can't say that happened that way or not.
No, because that's before. Because you can't tell that by any scientific method.
But George Zimmerman said it happened that way. That doesn't mean it's true, right?
As I said, sir, I can't testify to it, so that's it.
Okay. Now, what happens if it was just physically impossible to do what he said happened?
I would say it.
But you didn't get a chance to review that, and you're not here to testify about whether he took the gun out of the holster the way he did or not.
Right, because it's outside my ability to make a conclusion like that.
Right. Okay. You're just here focusing on the gun and how close it was to the skin or to the sweatshirt, correct?
That's correct,
I mean,
sir.
that's the bottom line.
In regard to Mr. Martin, that is, yes, sir.
Okay. Now, is it not true, sir, that one possibility, as you stated, is Mr. Martin was over George Zimmerman, the defendant, and he was like this, right? George Zimmerman was down on the ground, and Mr. Martin's like this on top of him.
Well, he'd be some way over him. I don't know what angle it is.
Well, is it this angle?
Oh, I can't tell you. The reason is because if you put your hand out, since it rotates, if someone was over horizontally, you could shoot that way. If they were at an angle, you could shoot that way, and you still get the path. All that I can say is consistent with him being over.
And it also could be consistent that they were facing each other, standing up.
You asked me that question once before, and I said the problem with that is the shirt would hang down. You'd have to grab the shirt with the other hand and then grab the shirt and pull it away this way. But the problem with that is if you then shot through the shirt in that area, when the shirt is let go and put back in position, the wound, because of that, moves over to the side. So the defect in the shirt would be over here if it was pulled this way. Because if you hold your finger on the shirt right here, and then if you pull the shirt this way, you've moved it to where it would be overlying the gunshot to get it away from the chest.
So you're saying that Trayvon Martin had to physically be on top, like this?
I'm saying that the physical evidence is consistent with Mr. Martin being over Mr. Zimmerman.
And is it not also consistent with Mr. Martin pulling away from Zimmerman on the ground, and you would have the same angle, he's pulling away, and Zimmerman shooting him at that time?
Yes.
Right? I think you said yes.
Yes, I did.
Okay, I apologize.
That's all right.
I told you I was a little bit hard of hearing. I want to make sure.
Well, that should be interesting since both of us seem to be that, so.
I was going to ask you what ear, but anyway. The other question I had is, in terms of possibilities, you mentioned blunt trauma, and I'm talking now about, I'm switching a minute, to George Zimmerman's head, the defendant's head.
Right.
In terms of that would be concrete, it's a possibility, correct?
Right.
Or maybe like a tree branch, that's a possibility for any of those bruises?
If you hit someone in the back of the head with a tree branch.
Or if you bump into it?
Where? The face or the back of the head?
Either one.
The problem with tree branches are, if you hit it in the face, they're rough and you would expect an abrasion.
Well, didn't he have an abrasion on the face?
No, he doesn't have abrasions. Don't forget.
What did he have on the face?
That's a contusion up there. The skin, if the skin is smooth and shiny, an abrasion is a scrape, like you fall on your knee and scrape.
Did he have any abrasions at all?
Yes, he did.
Okay,
Okay.
Go ahead. No, finish, please. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
He had a small abrasion on the right side of the nose, and then he had impact-type abrasions on the right area, the temple, the left temple, and then in the back he had the 2 lacerations.
So I'm struggling with you, we're wrestling, we're doing all that, and then I push you and you hit the tree? Couldn't that have been caused that way?
From the front?
From the back? Whatever.
Well, you'd have to have a tree branch there, and I didn't see any.
You didn't?
But wait a minute. But the other thing is if you just bump your head in, wood gives. Originally, police officers carried wooden batons. And the reason they carried the wooden batons were they're much less dangerous than metal things. Metals don't give. Wood gives. And so, I mean, if you hit someone hard enough on the back of the head, yes, you're going to get a laceration.
You know, I try to simplify things as best I can when it comes to medical stuff. You do any gardening at all?
No, my wife does.
Okay. I do gardening, and I've got a bald head, and if I don't wear a ball cap sometimes, I'll come up and I'll hit my head and there'll be a bruise or something from a tree branch. Isn't that possible?
An abrasion. I said there are abrasions back here. But what I'm saying is, whatever. Okay. Now I've lost my chain of thought. But.
Yes, sir. You weren't aware, and I'm showing you, Dr. DeMaio, that there was trees out there where at some point, even the defendant acknowledges that there was a struggle of some type near those trees.
My understanding of what you were saying was the trees were on the ground, not the...
Oh, I apologize. I'm talking about a live tree.
I saw the pictures and I saw the vertical trees. Right, yeah.
So, thank you, Your Honor. So that's a possibility, correct? For at least some of the bruising,
you could
abrasions.
Have one of the injuries due to bumping against a tree. That's correct, sir.
Okay. And also, some of the injuries that you described to the defendant, George Zimmerman, could be just from rolling around, and both of them rolling on the concrete, hitting the concrete as they're struggling or fighting.
Impact on the concrete. That's what I'm saying. Yes.
Right? I mean, that's consistent with what you're saying. Impact on the concrete. Is that correct? I was curious what you mentioned about Trayvon Martin, that you mentioned you described the injury to his left hand. I think, what did you call it? Or what did Dr. Bauer call it, I should say, because I know you got to rely on him, but
abrasion to the
you were agreeing with that assessment, correct?
Well, he called it, so I have to go with it.
Well, you saw the photograph, didn't you?
I'm not sure if I did or not.
Okay. Well, let's assume I can show it to you if you want, or...
No, go ahead. I'm listening to you.
Okay. And assuming that's an abrasion, you believe that there may be additional injuries under his knuckles, I think you said?
No. Those are two separate questions.
Okay.
One question was whether it's an abrasion, and I said, I can't disagree with the individual who did the autopsy. But I said, the next question was if you punch somebody, will you get bruises on your knuckles? And my answer was yes and no.
So you might not.
You might or you might not. If you really suspect something, they should have made a cut into the hand and then examined underneath.
And I gather if the person's still alive, you're not going to say, hey, let me cut all your knuckles, right?
Right, but what happened to the person's alive, you just sit there and wait a day or so, and then you'll know whether there's any hemorrhage.
But didn't you say sometimes you can hit something and not have any hemorrhaging at all?
Right. The problem, what I'm saying is, you can get it or you cannot. And if you have it, and you live a couple of days, you'll be able to see it. But the thing is if it's not there, it's not important.
I think, let me make sure I understand what you're saying, that you can hit somebody and not leave any bruising on your knuckles, correct?
That's correct, sir.
In other words, George Zimmerman could have hit Trayvon Martin and not left any bruising on his knuckles.
That's correct, sir.
You were asked a bunch of questions, and I think you were showing some photographs of George Zimmerman's head, right?
Yes,
all
sir.
parts of his head, and you gave your opinion as to what that is or not, correct?
Yes, sir.
Would you not agree, sir, that somebody who's familiar with his head, like a doctor that had treated him in the past, or like a physician's assistant would know what's existing there before that day and not in terms of what the shape of the body or the head is?
May or may not.
Okay.
I mean, you don't generally remember the shape of one of your patient's head, especially if you're seeing 20 or 30 patients a day. So,
well, my next question regarding that, would you agree that would be the best person that would see George Zimmerman alive right then and there what's happening the next day, would be able to describe what injuries he had or did not have?
In theory, if they do it correctly, yes. The problem is that emergency room records and doctors' records are generally lousy in regards to describing injuries. Very, very lousy.
Well, you agree that the fire rescue people do an honorable job in the sense that they know what they're doing, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not saying these people aren't competent, but their job is to treat patients, and they have a tendency not to document what they see. And that's why they want to put forensic nurses in emergency rooms to document these injuries, because doctors aren't interested in the injuries. They're interested in treating the patient.
Sure, but the fire rescue people are interested in injuries, aren't they?
They're interested, just like doctors, in treating a person. Because, like, if you read the records, they mention 2 lacerations. They don't even say where they are, except in the back of the head.
Well, Ms. Folgate actually measured it for you, and that's why you were able to detail exactly how little they were.
Right, well, 20 millimeters and 5 millimeters. But then they didn't say which one was on the right side, which one was on the left side, or located exactly. So, you know.
Now, you could tell, couldn't you, when you looked at the photograph?
Yes, but they didn't do it.
Okay.
And I couldn't tell which one was the 20 and which one was the 5 because the wound hadn't been cleaned up when they took the photograph.
Well, are we talking about the same photograph?
There were 2 photographs, remember? On the better one on the back of the head, there was still blood there, and you couldn't really tell which one was the 20 millimeter, which was the 5, because one of them had clotted blood on top of it.
Now, you do agree with the treatment in the sense of it didn't need any stitches, right?
I agree, but actually my answer should be it's outside my area of expertise.
Okay, so you're not quibbling with that, right?
But I will agree that they didn't need treatment.
You're sticking to your main thing is gunshot wounds, correct?
Well, I'm describing blunt force injuries. You're asking me about treatment, which is different.
I'm sorry.
You asked me about treatment, and I don't treat people.
Okay. You deal with them after they're dead.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But you did review the fire rescue report regarding the treatment of George Zimmerman, correct?
Yes, sir.
And when it says the patient has a GCS of 15, what does that mean?
Oh, that's the Glasgow index thing.
And what does that indicate to you, sir?
Oh, it means that he's perfectly fine. Everybody here has a 15. So in this room would be a 15. So.
And those are the fire rescue people that dealt with him right after this interaction between the defendant and Trayvon Martin.
That's correct.
Correct?
Yes.
Now, did I understand you correctly that you're saying that the difference between the photograph at the scene, that bloody photograph that he's got, do you have that big one by any chance? I know we've got it in evidence, but it wasn't fractured at all.
But then the swelling should still be there, which it wasn't 4 hours later.
Well, did you know whether they gave him something to put on there to control the swelling?
It's not going to change.
Okay.
It's not going to change.
Now, you also talked about the injury to the back of his head, right? The 2, I think, I'm going to call them scratches. That's not the correct. Are they lacerations?
Lacerations.
Okay, and those are what? How? There were 2 inches and 4 inches, you said?
Oh, no. It's 20 millimeters, which is a shade less than an inch, and the other one is 5 millimeters, which is about a fifth of an inch.
So one is about smaller than this?
Right.
And then one's about that?
Correct, sir.
You're not saying that that he would die from those, are you? Do you?
Oh, no, I never said that.
Oh, okay.
I said it's indicative of a hard impact, that's all.
Or maybe hitting a tree limb or just rolling around in the dirt and on the concrete?
It's indicative of a hard impact. That's all I said.
But you don't know whether it was a hard impact, somebody hitting him on the thing, or him rolling around in it?
It's a hard impact. That's all I can say. That's all I have said.
Yes, sir. Now, and you were aware that he was offered medical care in terms of going to see a doctor at some point, and he declined to do that.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, also, I believe Ms. Fulgate and also the fire rescue did not notice any kind of other injuries to the top of his head. Do you think they dismissed it?
No, there's two possible explanations. Is one that the bleeding continued after he was seen by EMS, and so you're looking at something where it's been bleeding for 4 or 5 hours, or they just didn't notice it because they knew there was an impact, they didn't consider it significant. But he went to the facility. No, he went the next day to the facility where he ran it, where physician's assistant Ms. Fulgate treated him, and she didn't notate all the injuries that you're describing. Well, that's the problem that forensic pathologists pull their hair out from, is that the medical personnel just don't describe injuries properly. Okay. Which is nothing bad against them, because their job is to treat people. My job is to look at injuries, not treat. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about this is, may I approach the witness, Your Honor? The photograph that was taken at the scene. Yes. I'm sorry, of the defendant. I apologize. Where he's got blood there, right? Right. Okay. I put my hand over that, right? Okay. Yes. What do you expect my hand to have on it? Blood. Sir, wouldn't you agree that that photograph I just showed you, that I put my hand over, you said you would expect blood in my hand. Wouldn't you agree that if he was bleeding like that the blood, if he's standing, the blood will go down, right? I'm assuming. If he's bleeding from the nose? It depends how profusely, but eventually it'll go down, right. Okay. Now, if I'm laying flat on my back and I'm bleeding from my nose, the blood will go inward, correct? Partially. Right? Some will go out and some will go in. And so it will be more difficult for me to swallow or to speak, I'm assuming, if blood's coming down, correct? Depends how profusely you bleed. Sure. Okay. Right. Well, assuming I was bleeding profusely, assuming I had a bloody nose or maybe even a fractured nose, and it was bloody, and I'm laying down, the blood would go into my mouth, correct, eventually? Yes, sir. So it'd be harder for me to swallow, talk, etc., I'm assuming, right? Yeah, unless you just start swallowing it. Okay. Now, did I understand you correctly that you did not view the video that was taken of George Zimmerman, the defendant, when he was brought to the police station, when he was being walked, and he walked fine and had no problems walking or talking? Actually, I've seen it, but they kept playing it on TV all the time. Okay. Yeah, I mean, he seemed to be walking fine and had no problems, correct? And that's being correct, able to communicate. That's right. And I know the recording that you saw of the defendant's interview was subsequent to that. I believe it was 2 days later. Yes, sir. But on that evening, right after he was in this struggle with Trayvon Martin, he was walking and talking fine. Yes, sir. Okay. You're not quibbling with that, right? No, sir. And you agree that there is actually no witnesses to the actual shooting other than the person charged with the crime, George Zimmerman, and the person that's dead? That's correct, sir. Regarding the gunshot wound, and I know that that's your focus in terms of how close, I think you stated it was up to 4 inches would be max, and then 2 inches, correct? Did I get that somewhere right? Between 2 and 4. Okay, and when you say 2 inches, you are accounting for the sweatshirt underneath, and then the
hoodie or sweatshirt with a hood over it, correct?
No.
You're not, because you're saying the hole kind of creates a barrier, or a hole, I guess.
Right. I'm talking between the skin and the muzzle.
Okay. Now, have you ever worn one of those hoodies? Those jackets, sweatshirts?
Not that type, no.
Okay. Have you seen people wearing them?
Yes, sir.
Don't they normally wear them a little big?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And don't they kind of hang down?
Yes, sir.
And if the person's wearing it hanging down, and he's got something in it, wouldn't it hang down?
I'll object to our speculation outside the scope of this particular case.
I don't believe I'm allowed to ask. He asked in terms of possibilities.
Yes, sir.
Wouldn't you agree that if I've got something here heavy, it's hanging down, right?
Right.
And that would make it a little tighter, wouldn't it?
Yes, sir.
You were asked about the DNA, and I know at some point you were head of the lab. I think it was in Texas too, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and you were asked about the DNA and about the possible packaging or improper packaging. I think you were asked about what the proper weight is and what it's not, correct?
Yes, sir.
And would you be surprised that that same object or piece of evidence, the shirt, let me backtrack a second. You're saying that the plastic would contaminate or cause mold, bacteria, and it would, I guess, retard or degrade whatever DNA is there, correct?
No. What I said was that you're supposed to dry the blood, and then you package it separately so that one piece doesn't contaminate the other. And you don't put it in a plastic bag because a plastic bag is airtight. If you wrap it in paper, then the paper kind of breathes.
Sure.
So if you put plastic bags on like a body and you put it in a refrigerator and then pull it out, you've got moisture all over it.
Right. But what if you put the piece of clothing or the article of clothing in a bag, paper bag, and you put it in plastic, whatever way you do it, but you keep it separate. You still believe mold to get into it, right?
Okay. You can always get mold into it. But if it dries, that's where you're drying it to prevent the bacteria and the mold.
Assuming you don't dry it properly.
Oh, then you'll get mold and you'll get bacteria.
And then whatever DNA is gone.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, you can lose some or all. Depends on how long you keep it in there.
Okay. Would you be surprised if there was DNA found in this area that apparently was mispackaged or whatever?
No.
Okay. You said you did review also the firearms report, is that correct?
Yes.
That was from FDLE, and you agreed with that in the sense of the findings in terms of the range and all that stuff, and stippling or soot or gunpowder, whatever words you want to use.
She just described soot and a few unburned grains of powder, right?
Am I safe to assume that your opinion is that somehow after George Zimmerman, the defendant, was punched or whatever, rolled around, whatever, he had an injury to his nose, that you believe it may have been fractured or at least displaced in some way, and that somebody out there at the scene put it back in place, correct?
Or he did, just by pulling
he could have done it himself.
Sure, just by pulling
I'm assuming that would have been painful.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so you believe he would have done it himself?
No, I didn't say that. You asked me who could do it, and I just added it to your list.
And, you're saying anybody could have done it?
Anybody could have done it.
Okay. Or nobody could have done it, and it just wasn't as bad as people think.
Well, if it's just swelling, it shouldn't have gone down in 4 hours. That thing is just so deviated. The most likely is that the nose is just deviated because it's been fractured.
But talk about another subject that's close to our hearts in the sense we're both bald-headed. In fact, I've been referred to as that bald-headed dude. I don't know if you've ever been called that before, but my question is, when we bleed there, tell us about the bleeding. It's very profuse, isn't it? Because
scalp bleeding is always profuse because the scalp has a lot of blood vessels in it.
More than other areas of the body, potentially?
Yes, sir.
And why is that?
I have absolutely no idea. That's how the design is. You know.
So the bottom line, sir, there are possibilities, and one of the possibilities is what you said, and then there's other possibilities of how that gunshot wound occurred. Is that correct?
To a degree. What I said was that it's consistent with what his account.
Right. And you're not saying the account where he's saying he grabbed the gun and how he took it out. You're just saying when the gun is out already.
That's
Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
I mean, I want to make sure the jury understands that. You're saying at the time he had the gun out already and was pointing it at the person he ended up shooting.
Yes,
correct?
Sir. Yes, sir.
And at that point, you don't know if Trayvon Martin was backing away in terms of providing an angle, or whether he was going forward. You can't say.
All that I said was it's consistent with his account, Mr. Zimmerman's account. That's all.
But it's also consistent with Trayvon Martin pulling back in terms of providing the same angle.
I told you that too, yes.
And I think I apologize, I've already asked you that. You're not here testifying about the holster, how that works, and the reason I ask is because you are, I don't want to say a firearms expert, but you are an expert regarding gunshots. You're not here about the...
No, sir. No,
nor
sir.
about the firearm himself, right?
Not about the firearm either. No, sir.
Now, if the hoodie or the sweatshirt with the hood on, do you need some water or something?
No, sir.
Okay. If the shirt's baggy, people are still able to grab it. In other words, it's still going to grab in terms of being bagged, right? If it's big, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I think you testified about the fact that your expertise is once the body is dead, not while alive, in terms of the trauma and all that. You're not an expert on that.
On
trauma to the head or anything like that, or are you an expert on that?
No. Okay, trauma is pathology, so I will testify on that. I don't testify to treatment.
Treatment on injuries to the head.
Right. I don't testify to treatment at all because I don't treat people.
Now, were you aware that out there at Retreat at Twin Lakes, in the area where this happened, that there's also, in addition to the concrete, walkway, there's also sprinkler boxes? Did you see any of those in the photographs you provided?
I didn't see any of those in the photographs, no, sir.
Okay, or you mentioned knuckles too, or fist, correct? As possibility, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now may I have a moment, Your Honor? You know whether George Zimmerman's right or left-handed?
Right-handed.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
Dr. DeMeyer, the notes that you prepared to assist you today in testimony, do they contain a summary of some of the measurements, for example? That Trayvon Martin was 5'11" feet inches and weighed 158 pounds.
That's correct, sir. Yes.
That his body mass index would be 22, which would be right in the middle of the normal range for a person his size.
That's correct, sir.
For example, you would have indicated that the location of the gunshot...
That's the leading nature of the questions.
Would you have indicated, for quick reference, where precisely the gunshot wound was on Mr. Martin's body, for example?
Yes, I put that down.
Do you need your notes to form your opinions once you have the facts before you?
Oh, no.
Do your notes include several pages of the photos that you think were the most pertinent in assessing the trauma to Mr. Zimmerman?
Yes, sir. 4 of the pages are just photographs.
Have we shown those photographs here?
Yes, sir.
The scope of your work, if you will, was to consider the statement that Mr. Zimmerman made to the police about how the shooting took place at the moment the shot was fired, and for you to consider the forensic evidence of that gunshot to determine whether or not Mr. Zimmerman's statement about what happened is consistent with the physical forensic evidence.
Leading and compound question.
Do you understand the question?
Yes.
Okay, you may answer.
Yes, sir.
To do that, is it necessary in your mind to review every witness statement, regardless of whether they saw the actual moment when the shot was fired?
That's correct, sir. I have to interpret the objective evidence. I'm not going to base my opinion on the witnesses because witnesses are wrong all the time.
Have you had occasion where you reviewed witness statements, people who claim to have seen something with their own eyes that was absolutely contradicted by the physical evidence that you knew to exist?
All the time. They'll say someone stood over a man and shot him, and 2 architects and a secretary said that. They saw it. The only problem is that the bullet taken from the body did not match the gun of the person who supposedly stood over him and shot him, and the bullet that hit him was a ricochet that had to have been fired from 20 or 30 feet away. So that's one case, but I've got half a dozen of those cases.
Let's talk for a moment more specifically, since Mr. Delarianda mentioned them by name. A woman named Celine Bahadur testified in the trial and didn't claim to have seen the individuals at the time the shot was fired. Would that matter to you at all?
No.
Let's talk about Jane Serdyka then, for example. Ms. Serdyka testified in the trial, and she said she was looking at the individuals outside her window some distance away and believes that she was looking at them when the shot was fired. What she described was that at the time the shot was fired, Mr. Zimmerman was on top of Mr. Martin.
Objection, leading and mischaracterization of the facts.
Can I finish my question, please?
Well, if it's a mischaracterization of the facts, I need you to rephrase your question.
It's not, Your Honor. I guess
that's for the jury to determine, so please rephrase your question.
Okay, sure. Ms. Serdyka said she was looking out the window and that she believes she was looking at the individuals when the shot was fired. She said that at the time the shot was fired, that Mr. Zimmerman was on top and that Mr. Martin was face down. Is that possible given the forensic evidence that you know in this case?
No, sir, it's not possible.
Mr. Martin wasn't...
He's shot in the front, so...
So would her statement have done you any good in this case?
No, sir.
In fact, that would be an example of how an eyewitness, no matter how well intended, just gets it wrong.
Yes, sir.
You did consider John Good's statement to the extent that he was the person.
Objection. It's a leading question.
Sustained.
John Good testified at the trial that when he looked out his back door, he saw the person later identified as George Zimmerman on his back on the ground, and that he saw Trayvon Martin straddling him on his knees, striking Mr. Zimmerman in some sort of MMA style. And then he went back inside, and some seconds later, the shot was fired. Is the position that Mr. Good saw Trayvon Martin straddling and striking Mr. Zimmerman, with Mr. Zimmerman on his back, consistent with the forensic evidence that you found at the time of the shot?
Yes, sir.
That statement, I take it, is separate and apart from Mr. Zimmerman's statement describing essentially the same thing.
Right, but again, I would not have used that to give my opinion. I have to use the physical evidence in conjunction with the statement of Mr. Zimmerman.
You pointed out in your direct evidence that there were 2 lacerations on the back of Mr. Zimmerman's head, and that you testified that you believed those 2 have been from separate impact.
Yes, sir.
Because you could see the sort of valley in between?
Yes, sir.
Those were the 2 blows that created the laceration.
Right, and in addition, they were so separate that if you impacted one, you couldn't get the other one. Mm-hmm. So there were 2 reasons.
Your testimony was that was consistent with having Mr. Zimmerman's head struck at least twice on a surface like concrete.
Objection is to the leading nature of these questions.
Setting the stage for the question.
Well, but they're all still leading. You need to rephrase your questions. Are the 2 lacerations with the valley in between on the back of Mr. Zimmerman's head consistent with at least 2 separate impacts on a surface like concrete?
Yes, sir.
And is it... I'm trying to figure out a way to ask you about tree branches. Were there any big tree branches that you knew in the vicinity of where this happened that were on the ground that could have been used as a club?
No. What you have is tree trunks, to be quite strictly speaking, but there's no tree branches that I could see. That's why when I first answered the question, I said there were no tree branches.
So for Mr. Zimmerman to have received those lacerations on the back of his head because of impact with a tree trunk, what would have had to have happened if, in fact, that were possible?
It practically have to be upright, sitting maybe, because you're going to have to hit the trunk. And you'd have to go back violently against the trunk on the 2 occasions. So it would still be blunt trauma to the back of the head twice.
Or it could have been from hitting his head on the sidewalk.
Right. Argumentative.
Well, overruled as to argumentative. All overruled as to leading. Please make sure you phrase your questions correctly.
Sure. Is that scenario much more plausible and consistent with the physical evidence?
The cement is more plausible, especially when you look at the injuries on the side of the head, which wouldn't be tree trunk because you've got a pattern of punctate abrasions.
You commented, of course, that there's a different role that some professionals play in dealing with someone that's been injured.
Yes, sir.
Whereas you may have a forensic approach, a treating doctor or PA may have a different objective.
Now, their objective is to treat somebody. My objective is to document the injuries and interpret the injuries. And, they don't care really, which is fine because their job is different than my job. And that's why they're pushing forensic nursing, to put forensic nurses in emergency rooms and to document the injuries correctly because they're trained to do that. But nobody wants to spend the money.
You had an opportunity to review the physician assistant notes that Ms. Fulgate took the next day?
Yes, sir.
And did you notice in the notes that she documented what generally would be known as black eyes?
Yes, sir.
Is that consistent for something that shows up later after receiving a blow to the nose?
Since it's secondary blackening of the eye, it shows up later. If you punch the eye directly, it'll usually show up immediately. If you punch the nose, the blood generally leaks into the soft tissue of the eye. And so that shows up like the next day or a few hours later.
It would not be surprising to you that someone who had sustained the blow to the nose that's shown in the photos the night of February 26th, that there might be associated black eyes the next day?
No, it wouldn't be surprising at all.
Regarding the issue of whether or not Mr. Zimmerman's nose was actually deviated or whether it just had some swelling that went down later, is that significant in whether or not he got punched in the face?
He'd still been punched in the face. The reason I say that there's a probable displaced fracture is the next photograph is 4 hours later, and that so-called swelling is gone, which most likely represents the fact that the nose was displaced, and now it's been put back into position.
Within the range of medical possibilities, is it possible that maybe his nose wasn't deviated, or if it was fractured, it wasn't deviated? Or does that matter in the sense of whether or not he got punched in the face?
No, he's obviously been punched in the nose, and he's been hit in the forehead.
That's the injuries up here you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
The GCS scale of 15, is that a reference to a paramedic note? Is that what that...
No, it's probably a check, is an area on the form where, a 15 means they're walking and talking and breathing, they got heart rate, and they're not really bad. Once you start, most people come into emergency rooms are 15s. Everybody in this courtroom is 15. To start going down, you have to start getting into trouble.
No, I take it you're not claiming in some way that Mr. Zimmerman wasn't able to walk or talk that evening, notwithstanding his traumatic injuries.
That's correct. What I'm saying is the type of injury he would get would be more of a stunning, not what most people would think of as a significant concussion. That's why I tended to get away from the word concussion, and I went to the non-medical word, a stunning type of injury.
The idea of a concussion that may lead to subdural hematomas, may lead to death, is something that happens after, at some point in time after the actual impact.
Objection, again, leading.
Please rephrase your question.
Are the consequences of the blow those that develop over some period of time after the impact?
No, usually concussions show up immediately. But the problem is that they can be extremely subtle. And that's why sporting events like to have doctors there, because lay people will look at someone who's got a concussion and will not pick up anything unusual if it's a mild concussion. Mm-hmm. Because then as it gets more severe, then it becomes quite obvious.
When you're getting hit like that, are you feeling it?
Oh, yes.
Are you in some appreciation that you're being injured?
Yes. I mean, if you get punched in the nose, believe me, you know it.
Does that continue to hurt for a while?
Yes, sir.
How about when you get your head banged on concrete? Does that hurt then and continue to hurt?
It can very well, yes, especially if you got lacerations. Hurt for a while, yes, sir.
Would someone at that moment, when this is actually happening to them, be able to know whether or not what was happening to them?
So there's lots of people out there who aren't happy with their internet.
Hey, Steve, did you say my internet's so bad I think it's giving my kids psychological problems?
You're in pain.
Yeah. Well, my friend, you're about to get Verizon Fios Quantum, America's fastest, most reliable internet.
So that's what you used to have. Looking at them outside, someone looking at them can say, oh, they're all right. But it happens all the time. You know, people, they think they're all right, and then they die a few hours later. Mm-hmm. That's why the police in this case should have taken Mr. Zimmerman to a hospital, not to the police station. Because if he had died in the police station, they would have been sued, and the family would have won the lawsuit because he had head injuries, and that means you take him to the hospital.
Mm-hmm. Even if there's not evidence of a concussion that he's stumbling or falling down or not able to talk.
If you have had head injuries like that, you go to an emergency room. You don't play around. People die in jail like that a lot of times. Mm-hmm. And the jails always lose the lawsuits, I'm going to tell you that.
Mm-hmm. So if someone is in the process of being hit and having their head struck on surface like cement, they're having this stunning effect and the pain associated with it. In the moment of that, not knowing when it's going to stop, are they able to say, I can take 3 more of these before I need to do something about it?
Leading and argumentative. Speculation.
Under these circumstances, with the trauma that you've seen in this case, would it be somewhat overwhelming the person that's on the receiving end?
Same objection.
Well, you gave 3 objections last time, so which one of them was it?
Leading and argumentative.
Overruled as to both.
Yes.
There were some questions about the packaging of the evidence, and especially if it's wet and has biological material on it. In this case, there's been testimony that the wet outer shirt in particular was sealed in a plastic bag while wet and then placed in a paper bag on the outside of that. Is that consistent with good evidence handling?
No, sir.
There was also testimony that when the bag was opened, it smelled very strongly of mold and an ammonia-type odor.
Because it's decomposing. That's why you air dry it and you put it in plastic and paper bags, not plastic, because you don't want the decomposition.
Is it accepted forensic practice that subjecting evidence to that type of packaging, you can also assume that it was in that condition for roughly a month, that would promote degradation or contribute to the likely degradation of the integrity of any DNA evidence on that clothing?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Mr. Della Rionda mentioned that if Trayvon Martin had put his hand over George Zimmerman's nose at this point in time, when there was blood, that there may have been some transfer of blood to Mr. Martin's hands. That's what that question was getting at. Yes. And you think...
Actually, it's the one I was getting at.
If Trayvon Martin had put his hand over George Zimmerman's nose and mouth when it was in this condition, is it your testimony that there may have been some transfer of blood to his hand?
Yes, sir.
I take it you would have no additional information as to whether or not Mr. Zimmerman's nose was actually bleeding at some point in time during the incident.
That's correct. I mean, you get an impact to the nose. You'll eventually bleed, but I can't tell you if you're going to bleed immediately or not. Just depends on what's injured.
Where that blood goes may depend on the position that your head is in?
Yes, it does.
Now, you've also talked quite a bit in direct about, in cross, I guess, indirect, about if you find something that's important, but if you don't, the absence of finding it doesn't necessarily make the absence of evidence important.
Right. That's a general fact that's understood. Absence doesn't mean anything. Presence does. Because especially if you don't know what the statistical probability that a thing is present is, how often do you actually find something? Like a transfer of DNA, how often does it occur? And you have to know that before you can even give a probability. If you haven't done that, you can't even give an opinion.
Do you agree that environmental conditions can affect whether or not DNA is present on physical evidence?
Oh, yeah.
For example, in this case, you can assume that it was about 3 hours from the event until Mr. Martin's body was transported. And during that time, while the body may have been covered with a blanket or covering on the outside, there was a period of time when the body and his hands were exposed to the elements.
Right, and then it's also how you enclose the body. Do you wrap it tightly or do you put it loosely? Again, putting it in plastic containers, plastic tends to rub and be stiff. So, if it's there, it's significant for most things. If it's not there, it's usually not significant.
You may also consider on that issue that there's been testimony that the weather conditions varied from a light drizzle to a heavy rain during these events. And would the fact that it was raining to some degree, could that also affect whether or not there's biological or DNA evidence collected from Mr. Martin's hands?
That's true. And or how the hands were handled and things like that.
Or perhaps even if they may have been washed prior to being photographed?
That's why the forensic pathologist is supposed to be with the body from the time it comes in. You should always be there. You should never leave the body, even if you have assistants helping you. You don't leave the body.
You wouldn't trust your assistants to do, well, I guess what you're saying is while you may trust your assistants to follow the protocol, you would confirm and verify.
Right. Like if you want if you want the clothing removed, you examine the clothing on the body before you say, okay, take it off. And then you stand there as they take it off to see if they're doing things appropriately and not maybe throwing it on the floor. You throw it on the floor, anything on the floor is now on the clothing. And then you have it put on a tray, but you don't have the clothing piled on top of each other because if there's some material on one piece of clothing and you put the other piece of clothing on top of it, you can get transfer. So you're supposed to be monitoring this the whole time.
Let me show you, Doctor, what's marked as State's Exhibit 28, which has been offered into evidence as
beyond the scope of cross-examination.
I don't know what it is.
I'll ask the question. The State's Exhibit 28 has been offered into evidence, and it represents a picture of Mr. Martin's chest taken at the scene by the crime scene technician. And then I'd like to show you State's Exhibit 95, which is in evidence and has been represented as a photograph taken at the time of the autopsy, but before any cleaning or washing was done to the body.
Stand objection, Your Honor.
If you'll please approach and show the pictures to the court. Yes, you may.
State's Exhibit 28 was taken at the scene. And if you would note whether there's any blood present in that photograph.
Yes, there's some blood around the nipple.
And if you would look at State's Exhibit 95, which was represented as being taken at the time of the autopsy, but before the body was cleaned. Do you see any blood in that picture?
No. In the original photo, there's a stream of blood running down from the nipple, down from the wound to the nipple, and that's missing in this photograph.
Evidently, someone cleaned it.
Yeah, it's been cleaned.
Objection is argumentative and speculation.
Sustained as to speculation. Overruled as to argumentative.
Thank you.
Dr. DeMeyer, the last two photographs that were shown, do you remember what the ones that were shown?
Yeah, that's the
scene.
I'm sorry, what?
I apologize. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yeah, the gunshot wound, one taken at the scene, allegedly.
One taken at the scene, State's Exhibit 28. Doesn't that show that the sweatshirt is up?
Yeah, it's been pulled up.
Right. And if it's at the scene while they're transporting the body and the body comes to the medical examiner's office with their sweatshirt down, wouldn't that absorb the blood there?
May I see the other photograph?
Sure.
Well, since it's not here, it's been removed, so it's been pulled off. So if you're asking me, could it have wiped the blood up as it was being pulled off? Sure.
In other words, you would expect the blood in a sweatshirt, correct?
Right.
Now, you were asked a bunch of questions by Mr. West. Do you agree that Mr. West testifying is not evidence, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And would you use Mr. West's statements to form your opinion?
No, sir. I used the autopsy report and the laboratory reports to form my opinion.
And the autopsy report, that was the one that you mentioned prepared by Dr. Bell, correct?
Right. And the photographs plus the firearms report to form my opinion. Yes, sir.
And you agree there was an absence of any X-rays or other actual proof of a broken nose, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you agree that there was absence of documentation of any kind of concussion or brain injury or brain bleeding, correct?
Oh, yes, sir.
And you agree that there was absence of any proof of anything being washed off the victim's body?
I can't say whether it was washed or not. What I said is that if that shirt was lying on there and they pulled it off, they could have wiped off some of the blood. And that's why you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to take the photograph of the wound intact before you clean it. And so there was a big no-no there, either way.
Are you saying that at the scene, the medical examiner personnel should remove the clothing of the victim, or should the clothing remain on the victim until he's transported to the ME's office?
No. What I'm saying is that the clothing should remain on the body, so the photograph taken at the scene, that's proper. But when they got to the medical examiner's office, they shouldn't have pulled if they wanted photographs of the scene as received, they shouldn't have undressed the body or pulled anything off, because they would be wiping it And then the rest of the whole chest is clean and such. So, the techniques weren't exactly correct. Let's put it that way.
But you did rely on Dr. Bau's report in terms of his findings, correct?
I had no other choice, sir.
Okay. And based on your observations of the photographs, they document what occurred in terms of
right? Yeah.
You're not disputing that?
Right. The photographs of the wound were the best thing.
Do you have absence? Is there any absence of evidence that anything was washed by the rain?
It would have to be. You have to know how much it's raining there, and you'd have to have an observation.
Pure
it could
speculation.
be washed away by the rain.
Pure speculation, correct?
Yeah, unless you were there and saw how much it was washed.
Okay. And there was an absence of vomiting, right? You didn't see any vomiting out there, correct?
No.
And finally, you were asked about John Good, what he testified. Do you agree that a jury that heard John Good's testimony should rely on what he said on the witness stand? Correct? And here's what I'm getting at.
It's kind of interesting. If he's got a good statement at the time and then he testifies something else on the witness stand, you begin to wonder.
Okay.
You know? I mean, I think that's up for the jury to consider.
Right. My question is, if John Good testified he neither saw nor heard any blows landing and neither saw nor heard anything being slammed on the sidewalk, does the physical evidence, is that what then you rely on?
No, I wouldn't. I tell you, I didn't rely anything on his statement.
Oh, you completely disregarded John Good.
No, I disregarded the witnesses because the problem, what I was trying to do was essentially take Mr. Zimmerman's statement and see whether the physical evidence was supported or invalidated his statements.
So,
because the witnesses, they're all over the place. You can't use the witnesses to make autopsy decisions.
But isn't what George Zimmerman, the defendant, is relaying to the police, isn't he, in effect, a witness in terms of what happened?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's why you don't believe him and you do the tests and look at the autopsy to check what he said matches what you find at the body.
Right. And what you did is you relied on one of his statements, and the bottom line is what you could say is the gun was out and it was 2 inches from the body.
2 to 4 inches from the body.
2 to 4 inches. Right. Correct? Thank you.
One very narrow area. And this notion of the absence of evidence not being evidence of absence notion. If Mr. Good didn't testify that he heard George Zimmerman's head hitting cement like this in some way, does that in any way mean that Mr. Zimmerman's head didn't actually get hit on the cement?
No.
Same thing, if Mr. Good didn't hear Trayvon Martin hit George Zimmerman in the head like this, does that mean George Zimmerman didn't get hit in the head to cause the injuries that you saw?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. May Dr. DeMaio be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. West, may Dr. DeMaio be excused? Okay, thank you very much, Doctor. You're excused. Call your next witness, please. Your next witness is?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. 1 moment. Mr. Bonaparte, Your Honor. Sorry for the delay.
And his first name is? Okay, we'll ask him when he gets on the screen.
Do you solemnly swear from the testimony presented will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you.
No, we approach him very briefly.
You may proceed, yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir. State your name, please.
Norton N. Bonaparte Jr.
And your occupation.
City Manager, City of Sanford, Florida.
How long have you been so employed?
A year and a half.
And you were employed then back in February of 2012 when this event happened, correct?
That is correct.
I want to focus your attention, if I might, on a very particular event, and that is the event that surrounds the playing of what we now know to be a 911 call to the Martin family. Okay? I understand that there were some decisions that were made getting us to that point. We're not concerned or going to inquire into the reason. I only want to talk to you about the actual event, okay? I'd like you to focus on that. My understanding is, and if I might be given some leeway to lead a slight bit to focus the witness, my understanding is that that a decision was made to play the tape for the Martin family, correct?
The decision was made to play a number of tapes.
Correct, including, and I know that there were several tapes that were played. Those were police evidence tapes of the investigation surrounding this event, correct?
There was the 911 and the non-emergency number.
Yeah, several of them, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I want to focus your attention particularly on one, though I realize that several were played. When the decision was made to play those tapes, who actually took care of the process of playing the tapes?
It was the mayor's office, and it was myself and the mayor.
Okay, so both you and the mayor actually did the physical playing of the tapes, correct?
To the best of my recollection.
Okay. Was there any conversation with law enforcement before that as to how to accomplish the playing of the tapes for these witnesses before it happened?
At that point, they weren't witnesses, they were parents.
Is that a no?
Please repeat the question.
Yeah, okay. The question was whether or not you had any conversation with law enforcement as to how to play these tapes to these people. You say they weren't witnesses, let's just call them people. Were there any conversations with law enforcement as to how to accomplish this playing of the tapes, yes or no?
No.
Okay. So that did you and the mayor just decide on your own as to how they would be played?
The decision was made to make them public, the purpose of showing them to the Martin family so they heard it first as a courtesy to the family.
Absolutely. I understand both the courtesy and the sensitivities that you were dealing with, sir. My focus is a little bit different than that, however, okay? Here's my focus.
Okay.
When the actual decision to make the tapes play for the Martin family, was it your decision? Was it the mayor's decision as to how that would occur?
The decision was made just to allow them to hear them.
Okay. Was there any consideration given to the idea of playing them to those individuals separately, one separate from the other, so as to not infect their view or what they heard one to the other?
No, there was not.
So the way that it occurred, then we know from other testimony, was that the tape was played, and again, I know that there were several tapes. The tapes were played with the entire family present in one room, correct?
That is correct.
And were you the one playing the tapes?
I don't recall exactly who was playing it. We used a computer.
Well, if you would, give us the setting as to who was doing what with the tapes.
It was a disc that we were using a laptop so that they can hear the tapes.
Yes, sir. And who was doing what?
I don't recall specifically. It was either myself or the mayor.
Who was present?
The mayor, the Martin family, and the attorneys, Mr. Crump and Miss Natalie Jackson, and the Trayvon's brother, and then there was another individual, and I don't know his name.
Was there any law enforcement present?
No.
Was that a decision that you and or the mayor made to keep law enforcement out of the room?
We had asked the family, I asked the family if they wanted law enforcement, and they said they'd rather have law enforcement not in the room at the time, and so we obliged their request.
And did you discuss that with Chief Lee in regard to his desire to be in the room?
At that point, we just informed the chief as well as the other officers to not be in the same room.
Do you recall how many times the tape was played?
Which tape?
Let's focus on the 911 tape that had these screams for help on it.
No, I do not.
Were you there for all of the times that it was played?
I was in the vicinity. I wasn't always in the room.
Okay. Was either you or the mayor, that's Mayor Triplett, correct?
That is correct.
Was either you or he in the room at all times the tape was being played?
I do not recall.
How many times was the tape played while you were in the room?
I do not recall.
More than one?
The tape that has the screams, yes, that was played more than once.
And was that at the request of anyone in particular?
I believe it's at the request of the family.
Anyone in particular in the family?
I do not recall.
Did they give you any reasons for why they wanted to hear it more than once?
I think they just wanted to hear it again.
Did you record or take any notes as to any responses they had regarding what they heard on the one tape of particular concern?
No, I did not.
Did you record the event of this happening in any form or fashion so that law enforcement or others might have it?
No, we did not.
Was it recorded by audio or video?
No, it was not.
Was anyone there like a court reporter just to document exactly how it occurred?
No, it was not.
Was any consideration given by you or the mayor at all to do it in a fashion that could record it should law enforcement or anybody else need it for future purposes?
We were releasing it to the media that evening, and we just wanted the family to have the courtesy of hearing it first, and we did not have it recorded.
Okay, and I'm sorry, so I don't mean to banter with you. My question was fairly specific as to whether or not you gave any consideration to the concept of recording it so that if law enforcement or anybody else in the future needed it, it would be recorded. That event of the first time half a dozen family members listened to that tape was recorded at all. Is that a yes or a no?
It's a no.
Just a moment, Your Honor. And just to be clear, the attorneys that you say were present were not city attorneys, they were the Martin family attorneys, correct?
That is correct.
The only two people representing anybody in Sanford, from law enforcement to the police, law enforcement to the administration, was yourself and May Triplett.
That is correct.
Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Bonaparte, the bottom line was that it was the decent thing to do to play it for the family before it was released to the public.
That was our intent.
And that's why it occurred the way it did. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you, sir.
Any redirect?
No, thank you.
Thank you. May Mr. Bonaparte be excused?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. You are excused. Please call your next witness.
I hate to approach. There's a witness that we want to appear in a unique way. I want to talk to the court about that, if I might. And I didn't know if this might be a time for the jury to take a break at 3:10.
Well, why don't you approach first and find out. Mr. O'Mara, call your next witness.
The defense would call Eloise Dilligard, Your Honor.
Okay, go ahead.
Ms. Dilligard, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. The clerk, Lisa, is going to swear you in. You'll be requested to raise your right hand. So I would ask that you do that. And if you would.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm testimony presented will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. And I first want to thank you. I understand that you're homesick and appreciate you spending some time with us today. I think I've asked you your name. Tell me your name again.
Eloise Dilligard.
Okay. And and if you would spell your last name.
D as in David, I-L-L-I, G as in Gary, A-R-D as in David.
Thank you, ma'am. And back in February of 2012, did you live at the retreat at Twin Lakes?
Yes.
How long had you lived there at the point of February 2012?
By that time, it was about 2.5 years.
Okay. You have since moved out of that location, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I want to take you back to the time that you lived at the retreat at Twin Lakes and ask you if you knew somebody by the name of George Zimmerman.
I did.
And how long had you known him?
Ever since we moved in October of 2009.
Would you consider yourselves friends?
He was my neighbor. We spoke on a friendly basis, had no problems with one another.
Okay. And were there times that you became aware that he was involved in a program called Neighborhood Watch?
Yes.
Okay. Did you ever see him in the neighborhood patrolling or doing anything like that as part of Neighborhood Watch?
No.
But you did know him as a friend or a neighbor?
As a neighbor, a friendly neighbor.
Okay. And focus your attention now, if I might, on February 26th, which of course is the night that Trayvon Martin was shot. Do you remember that night?
I do.
What I'd like you to do, if you would, is to tell the jury what first brought your attention to the event that you eventually came out or came to find out was the shooting we're talking about.
I was coming from Walmart down Reinhardt to go to Oregon and make a left, and a policeman approached me from the rear. And of course I thought, well, I didn't do anything wrong, but then only to find out he wanted to go around me, so I pulled over. And as I was coming up Oregon to go into my neighborhood, I noticed that the police was going into the neighborhood. So when I pulled in, I looked down from the mail station down to the left and saw that there was crime scene tape going up. And I didn't want to go directly down, so I came around the right-hand side where I lived to go around the back way and asked a couple guys that were standing outside, and they told me they didn't know what's going on, but there was another policeman coming. So I then proceeded to come back around and go back around by the mail station toward the crime scene area.
Okay. And do you recall what the weather was like during that time?
It was very rainy that night.
Okay. And at some point, as you got closer to what you call the crime scene, did you notice any vehicles that were familiar to you?
Yes.
And whose vehicle? And what vehicles were they?
It was George's truck.
And could you describe that, if you would?
I believe it's a gray Honda Ridgeline.
Okay. If you could, tell the jury as best you can where within this area you noticed the truck.
Because of the way our road is for Retreat View Circle, it was more like on the curb or nearing the curb down by where the crime scene was.
Okay, let me ask it this way.
Which I believe was on Retreat View Circle. I'm not really sure exactly.
Okay. Do you know the area that has come to be known as the T intersection, which is very close to where the incident itself occurred?
Yes.
And though you may not have known the names then, there's a woman who lives in the end unit right by that T intersection by the name of Jenna Lauer. Do you know her?
No, I don't.
Okay. If we were to, I would ask for you to accept as a premise that she was living in that first condo or townhome just at the intersection of the T intersection and the sidewalk. Would you know what I was talking about?
Yes.
Okay. And to fast forward a moment, this was an area where you had testified in deposition that you actually had some conversations with police. So I'm just trying to geographically locate. If we were to presume that Jenna Lauer's townhome was that first one in that row of houses, where was the truck parked in reference to that?
If she was in the first one, then the truck would have been parked looking toward the east. It would have been slightly south of where her condo would be.
So if you were to walk out her front door, would you be looking sort of right at the truck?
Well, not right at it, but you would have to look more to the right if you were walking out of her condo, if her condo was facing Retreat View Circle.
Okay, because that would then put the truck parked on the curb. As you would walk out her front door, it would be parked to the curb on the right-hand side of that street?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you say Retreat View Circle. Is that the street that actually circles around, or is the perimeter of the complex itself?
It does.
Okay. Is Miss Lauer actually on a street that comes off of Retreat View Circle?
If I'm visualizing exactly where you're talking about, I believe her condo would be facing Retreat View Circle. Yes.
Okay. How would it the front door, if I walked straight out her front door, would I eventually walk right into the clubhouse area?
No, you would have to walk down the street to the west.
Okay. Let's talk then about wherever the truck was located. You saw it in reference to the crime scene. You saw it in that area?
Yes.
Okay. And we may come back to a map in a minute and see if we can show you a map of the area. But let's move to the point where you came up to the area where the crime scene was. Describe what you first saw.
There were quite a few people standing on the sidewalk. There were people who were closer down to where the yellow tape was. And I kind of looked around, to see if I saw George, because I saw his truck. And after I didn't see him, then I recognized the lady from one of the HOA meetings, and I asked her what happened. And she said, I believe...
Ma'am, Ms. Delegard, when you hear one of us say an objection, that means the court has to inquire. So I just hold on to your testimony for 1 second. You didn't do anything wrong. Just want to check with the court.
Okay, what is the objection?
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained as to what somebody else said.
Your Honor. Did you know the person's name who you spoke to?
I don't know her. All I know is she's from Pembroke Pines.
Okay. So you had a conversation with her about the events that she perceived?
I simply asked what was going on, and that was her reply to me.
Okay. And at some point then, did you speak to any law enforcement officers?
After I could not find, or after I didn't see George, I did attempt to talk to some of the other residents that was there. And after I felt like, well, okay, I'm not in harm's way, I was walking away, and a policeman came up and said to me, "You don't want to talk to me." And I turned around and I said, "I don't know what I can tell you because I wasn't here when anything happened."
Okay. And then what did the law enforcement officer say to you?
He then replied, "Well, we're trying to find someone who may know the people involved in the shooting."
Okay. And did he have any further conversation with you or show you anything?
He just asked me would I mind staying up, and he was going to go and take a picture and bring it back to the group of us that were standing there to see if we could recognize either the victim and or the suspect.
Did that officer happen to identify himself to you by name that you can recall?
He did not, and I'm usually pretty perceptive to look at a name badge, but, with everything going on, I don't remember.
Okay. So at some point then, did he show you a picture or two of people who were involved in this event?
He came back with what I believe was an iPhone, and I'm only saying that because I own one, with 2 pictures.
Okay.
And I, along with the others standing there...
Let me interrupt for a moment to ask you if you could identify either by name or by description the other people who were present during that time.
There was a young Caucasian man. I can't remember his name. It was either Jeremy or Jonathan. And then there was a couple there. They were married, but I did not get their names.
Okay. And were they then present when this picture or these pictures were shown?
They were.
Okay. Were you able to identify anybody in either of those two pictures?
Yes, I was.
And who was that?
That was George Zimmerman, my neighbor.
Okay. We have seen those pictures here quite a bit in the courtroom. I'm not going to show it to you directly right now unless I have to. But was that a picture where Mr. Zimmerman had a bloodied nose?
He did have a bloody nose, yes.
Okay. And there was describe the difference, if any, you saw between the picture that you saw that night and the George Zimmerman who you knew before that night.
His nose was very bloody, and to me, it looked very disfigured, like it was, let's see, I'm looking at him, so then it looked like it was somewhat to the left or right, but I know it was not the way I knew him. His face was the nose was very disfigured and a lot of blood coming from it.
Okay. Did it take you a minute or two, or how long did it take you to even figure out that was the same person? His face still looked the same. The only difference was the disfigurement and the blood in his nose. Did you advise the law enforcement officer who was present of this person, George Zimmerman's name?
Yes, I said, that's my neighbor George.
Okay. And did anybody else, as you can best recall, identify the person as well?
Objection as to hearsay.
Sustained.
Don't answer that. After you identified George Zimmerman as the person in the picture, were you shown a second picture?
I was.
And now was that anyone who you identified?
I did not know the person's name. I had seen him in passing probably earlier that day, but I didn't know who he was.
Okay. And do you know now that person was Trayvon Martin?
Yes.
After then you identified George Zimmerman, what was the next thing that you did, or who'd you talk to about that event?
Are you talking about that night?
Yes, ma'am.
If I can remember correctly, I think the first concern was where his wife was, if his wife was there.
Okay, was that your concern, you mean?
Yes, because I knew he was married and I didn't see her, and they're my neighbors, and once I saw his face and what looked to be, been hurt, my first concern is where's his next of kin, his wife.
Okay, and what'd you do about that?
Well, after, there was nothing else I could do at that point. Once I found out that, as I thought, I was no longer in harm's way because my husband was out of town, I went back down to my house, parked in my driveway, got out of the car, and went up to George's residence and knocked on the door to see if Shelley was there. I rang the doorbell, I knocked, I heard the dog, but nobody came to the door. Shortly thereafter, Shelley pulled up behind, perpendicular to the driveway. She didn't pull in because I was walking away. And she asked me, where is...
Your Honor, I would ask to be heard on that hearsay objection, if need be. It's not often for the truth of the matter of what Ms. Zimmerman may have said, but it just says...
I don't want speaking responses. Please approach.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Delegati, are you still there?
I'm here.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the patience. Well, I think we were talking about that you had a conversation with Shelley Zimmerman?
Yes, a brief conversation.
And after that, what did Ms. Zimmerman do?
Once I concluded my conversation, she sped off around to the crime scene.
Okay. Now, I may have taken you out of time a little bit. I want to go back. When you were there with the police, well, let me ask you this. Did you go back to the area of the event at all that night?
Yes, I did go back down there to make sure she was okay. but to see her, so I got back in my car and I went home.
Okay. My understanding was that you were present during, that you were questioned by law enforcement to the extent that you've told us about. Were you present during any other witnesses' discussions with law enforcement?
Yes, the young man that was there alone, and then the other couple spoke to the policeman in terms of what they knew.
Okay. I don't want you to tell us precisely what you heard them say, because law enforcement may have already testified to that. But were you there when those people gave their statements to law enforcement?
I was there when they gave their verbal statement, but I was there when they get their written statement.
Okay. And I'm going to ask you if you could be a bit more precise. I know that you don't recall names. I believe you said one might have been Jeremy and another one Jonathan. Was that correct?
That's what I think I remember about the names, but again, I'm just not sure.
That's fine. But do you recall, were there 3 people? I think you said 1 female and 2 males, or were there any more than that who gave their verbal statements to law enforcement in your presence?
In my presence, there was a couple, a male and a female, and then there was a gentleman who was by himself.
Okay. Did you give any verbal, except for what we've talked about so far, did you give any verbal or written statements to the police that night?
No, other than he asked me my name, and I gave it to him, and I gave him my phone number.
Okay. And then, and now I think we'll go back to the time where you left the area of the event, first ran into Miss Zimmerman, went back looking for her, didn't find her, and left the second time?
Correct.
Okay. At some point, then, did you give statements to law enforcement regarding what you knew or heard about the event?
Yes. There was an FBI agent who left a card on my door and requested I call him. So I called.
Okay.
And he and another agent came to my house and interviewed me.
And you gave them a statement about whatever information they asked you about, I presume?
That is correct.
Okay. At some point, did you have an opportunity to listen to what we call, and have been calling during this trial, the Lauer 911 tape? And by for your purposes, that is the tape that has the this voices in the background screaming for help. Have you had an opportunity to listen to that?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell me the circumstances or the setting around the first time that you listened to it?
The first time that I heard it was when it was played on one of the local news channels.
Okay. Were you by yourself or with anyone else?
I really don't remember.
Okay. How many times have you listened to the tape?
Besides that time, well, it was played over and over, but I would probably say maybe 2 or 3 times.
Okay. Did you hear a voice screaming for help in the background that you were able to recognize or identify?
I heard the voice screaming in the background, and of the 2 that we are discussing, the deceased Trayvon and George, I've only heard George talk.
Okay. Whose voice do you believe that was in the background screaming for help?
Based on the fact that I've only heard George's voice, and it's a light male voice, I would say that it was his.
And by his, you mean whom?
George Zimmerman.
Okay. And when you say you've heard him talk, tell us again about how long you've known him.
By that time, it was 2.5 years.
Okay. An opportunity to hear him both speak to you and speak to others in your presence?
That is correct.
Ever hear him yell for his dog or laugh at a joke or anything like that you can recall?
Never heard him yell at the dog. I mean, whatever commands he gave the dog were very, just like a voice talking to someone next to you. But again, from what I heard, he has a light male voice.
Okay. I'm going to ask you then, I'm going to try something that may work. I'm going to show you an exhibit. It states Exhibit 1, and just see if there's any chance that this can be done in a way where you can identify the picture. And then we'll have you try and walk us through a location where you may have seen George Zimmerman's truck, okay? So what you're seeing now should be blocked pretty soon by a picture. Can you see that picture?
I can see the picture.
Okay. Let's just see if this works in any form or fashion.
You need to bring it up a little. It's going out of my focus.
Okay. Let me try something else then.
That's better.
Okay. For you, maybe. Hold on for 1 second.
Sure.
Does that work? Can you at least...
That works.
All right. I'm going to move it a little bit to an area. Okay. Can you describe what is barely on the screen at this point? Can you see that?
The only thing I can see is a blue line, a little bit of grass, and the white border on the picture.
Can you see the pool that's in the center of the photo?
I can.
No, it's not. What do you mean? If I might. It is. Okay. Unless we start talking about mirror images, Your Honor, that's not going to work, so I'll move on to another area of inquiry. Ms. Delegard, I'm going to try to do what we were just going to do visually. And ask you this. You are familiar with the complex, correct?
I am.
Okay. You sort of gave us a walk or a drive-through as to how you entered into the complex. Can you tell me what entrance you came into that night?
I came in the entrance that is directly in front of Bentley Elementary School.
And is that the one that when you drive in, you have the clubhouse immediately in front of you and just to your right?
That is correct. Okay.
From that point, and I know we're testing your memory since you don't live there anymore, from that point, as you're coming in Oregon, I know that you took a sort of back route over to your complex because you took a right on Retreat View Circle, correct? When you first came in.
No. If you say the back route, then you're talking about the part of Oregon that goes up to 46A or Johnny H.E. Thomas.
Yeah, I confused it by saying that. My understanding... One moment, if I might. Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
That's okay.
All right.
I can hear you.
I think I confused my question a moment ago. My understanding was that when you first came into your subdivision, you realized that there was some crime scene tape, correct?
Correct.
As you're coming into the main entrance with the clubhouse off to your right, which way was the crime scene tape from where you were driving in?
To the left or to the east.
Okay. And that would have been Is that the normal way that you would go from that main entrance to your residence? You would go to the left?
No, I would go to the right.
Okay. All right. Now, what I would like to do is start at the Oregon main entrance with the clubhouse on your right. And if you can sort of walk or drive us to the area where you did drive up to get a better view of the area of the crime scene itself.
If I were to drive in to the entrance that was directly across from Altomedes Bentley Elementary, I would have made a left rather than a right to go down to where the crime scene was.
Okay. And where on that scene then would you have seen George's truck?
Oh boy, it wasn't even 0.3 of a mile down because it's not that far.
Okay. Could you have a present memory today as to where the truck was?
It was parked on Retreat View Circle, just to the left of where you're talking about the T area was.
Okay. Let me ask it this way. I'm going to refresh your recollection with some testimony potentially. Could the truck have been parked not on Retreat View Circle but on the 2nd Street in, so that, you know the 2nd Street in I'm talking about? So if you don't take...
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, you don't take your first left onto Retreat View Circle, but you take your second left onto Twin Trees? Twin
Trees Lane, I believe it is.
Could that have been the street that you turned down and saw Mr. Zimmerman's truck?
It could have been. All I know is that it was on one of those curves.
Okay, that's okay. Nonetheless, wherever that truck was, it is your testimony that it was directly in front of, maybe a touch off to the right of what we've identified as Miss Lauer's townhome?
Yes.
Okay. So if we were to use Miss Lauer's townhome as the focal point, you would walk out or look out her front door and look just to your right to see George Zimmerman's truck where it sat that night?
That is correct.
Okay. I have a moment, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Okay.
I'll try and assist as best I can with the compromise of having it this way.
Okay, thank you. Cross?
Ms. Delegard, can you see me all right?
No.
She kind of,
sort of.
It's looking straight up. That's what she sees.
Okay. Can't see me still?
I can see you through the just beyond the little projector. Yes.
Okay. I don't know if you remember me. I'm Bernie Della Rionda with the State Attorney's Office.
Yes, I do remember you.
Okay, great. I just have a few questions and then we'll get you out of here. Okay, or we'll leave you alone, I should say. Since you're yes, ma'am. The bottom line is that day you came into contact with a police officer who told you there was a suspect and a victim, showed you some photographs. You recognized one photograph as George Zimmerman. The other photograph, you didn't know the person. You now know it's Trayvon Martin, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And you said you had seen him earlier in the day in the retreat at Twin Lakes, correct? Just walking around?
Right.
Okay. And then finally, you were asked about the voice. You mentioned you saw it on TV, correct?
Correct.
And you didn't have a point of reference. All you knew was George Zimmerman's voice, but you had never heard Trayvon Martin's voice, correct?
That is correct. I've never heard his voice.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Any redirect?
A sick woman in her bed who came with us. I think we're done with her and do appreciate her coming.
Okay.
Ms. Delegard,
Yes.
we are done. I appreciate your time. Thanks very much for doing this from your home, and I apologize for the interruption. I hope you feel better.
It's okay.
Thank you. May Ms. Dilligard be excused from being recalled?
Excused by the defense, yes.
Okay. You're excused. That means that you don't have to appear again. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, and when you're finished with that, if you'll approach for just one moment. And so I'm going to let you go home at this time. It's 4:21. Before, as you're starting to get your notepads in order, I'm going to give you my admonitions. During the overnight recess, you're not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else. You're not to read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case. You're not to use any type of an electronic device to get on the Internet to do any independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology. And you're not to read or create any emails, tweets, text messages, social networking pages about the case. Do I have your assurances that you will abide by these instructions? Okay, with that, put your notepads face down and follow Deputy Jarvis back into the jury room. And we'll have the jury back at 9 a.m.